Welcome to the campus of North Idaho College and today's broadcast of the North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of North Idaho College television students. Your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the sixth week of a 7-week series on the topic Racism, Prejudices, and Progress. For those of you who have been viewing our programs for the past few weeks, we have had national spokespersons from various minority representatives to talk to you about this very, very important topic. It's a very special privilege to welcome to the program today the Honorable John V. Evans, the Governor of the state of Idaho. Governor Evans has been with us today to talk about human rights, particularly as it relates to the state of Idaho. Our governor has a very distinguished background. He's been in politics since the age of 27 after completing his work at Idaho State University and graduating from Stanford University. He served in the Idaho State Senate and was majority leader from 1957 to 1959. He was then mayor of Malad from 1960 to 1966 and returned to the Idaho State Senate, where he served as minority leader. He was elected lieutenant governor of our state in 1974 and became the 26th governor of Idaho on January the 24th, 1977, when Governor Andrus resigned to become a member of President Carter's cabinet. Our governor has been reelected twice since that time. He also has served as the chairman of the Western Governors Conference, and this year he was actually the host of the National Governors Conference in Idaho. Governor Evans, we've had you many times before, and we're happy to have you here today to discuss this very important topic.
Thank you very much, Tony. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I would invite to the panel to ask our questions today, first of all, Dr. Owen Cargill, who is the Dean of Instruction at North Idaho College, and Janelle Burke, an attorney in our city. And I will ask Dr. Cargill to commence the questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Governor Evans, you've been quoted as saying to be tolerant of prejudice is to be a part of it. I wonder if you'd care to elaborate on that.
You know, we think in terms of spending our lives objecting and teaching our children to not allow ourselves ever to be a bigot, not ever tolerant of racism at all. But if you place yourself in that position of being tolerant to bigotry or racism, then you become a part of it. So I emphasize to my children that you should speak out. Be an outspoken citizen to prevent that from happening and prevent from becoming a part of the whole process.
Thank you. Janelle Burke.
Governor, can you explain to us about the Idaho Human Rights Commission? What is it? When was it founded? Where does it fit within our state government?
In 1969, I was in the legislature at the time, and we initiated and recognized the need for our Human Rights Commission. We were having some very serious problems in relation to some prejudice occurring in education, in civil rights. We didn't think that was really happening in Idaho, but there were a lot of complaints coming to the governor at that time, Don Samuelson. So we initiated through the legislative process the passage of our Human Rights Commission Act, and it's been in operation since that time. It's handled all kinds of issues, employment issues, property issues, education issues. Any place where there's a complaint issued by a citizen, the Human Rights Commission investigates those complaints and then makes a determination whether they're valid or not, and then overcomes by a directive to solve that particular problem. Once again, it's been a very effective tool in Idaho, and Marilyn Schuler has been the director of the Human Rights Commission now for a number of years, and she probably is more knowledgeable on that subject than possibly anybody in the entire western United States.
Where does it fit within the Idaho state government, within the scheme of Idaho state government?
Well, actually, it's an independent agency within the administration. They're directly responsible to a commission. That commission is appointed by the governor, and I've made it a point as governor to make sure that we get a racial mix on the commission itself. So that there'll be no question in anybody's mind that we're not going to tolerate any kind of racism any kind of bigotry, any kind of activities that are prejudice to any citizen of the state. We have a substantial mix on that commission, and they're outstanding citizens representing all of the regions of the state. Larry Broadbent is a recent appointee to the Human Rights Commission here in Idaho, and he'll serve now for a term of 3 years. And we're very happy to have him here. As you recognize, Larry is an under sheriff here in Kootenai County, and he's been very much involved in monitoring what's taking place out at the Aryan Nations compound there at Hayden Lake. And we were very happy to have him accept that responsibility, because he adds a substantial strength to the commission in recognizing the problems associated with that racist movement.
How does this Idaho Human Rights Commission relate to commissions perhaps in other states or the United States? Many of our viewers are from outside the state of Idaho. How does our commission relate to other commissions?
Well, I'm sure, and I'm not positive exactly how they coordinate their activities, but I would suspect, knowing Marilyn Schuler and knowing our commission, that they're in constant contact with the commissions of similar nature and similar responsibility in every state in the nation, so that if we have a complaint that occurs here in Idaho or has an effect on a citizen within another state, that they will deal with it directly in association with those other commissions.
Governor Evers, I would like to pursue along this line concerning legislation in Idaho. Some years ago, a white supremacist group moved into northern Idaho, and we all know from our experiences it's such a minute number compared with the general population. But out of that problem was created the Kootenai County Task Force on Human Relations, and then there was an interstate task force. Would you share with our viewers how that problem came about to create this task force and to come to your office and to the state legislature to deal with laws and bring us up to date on what's happened in that area?
Well, what really was occurring, and particularly in this area of the state, we were seeing some racism activities that really directed toward what was happening out at Hayden Lake. And we were seeing crosses being burned in lawns. We were seeing people harassed because of their race, because of their jobs, many different reasons. And it became intolerable that we had so many complaints taking place that something had to be done to overcome this particular racist activity being directed toward our citizens. So what really happened was the task force on human relations that what was created here in Kootenai County, and it initiated the malicious harassment bill in the legislature. It was all starting right here, and I'm very proud of the fact, and I think the people of Kootenai County should be proud of the fact that they were not going to tolerate a continuation of that prejudice that was occurring. So the malicious harassment bill came to my desk, came to me, and I endorsed it very strongly and vocally. As a result of my endorsement, as a result of the efforts being put forth by the task force here in Kootenai County, we saw a snowball taking effect. People from all over the state jumped on the bandwagon and recognized that we should not tolerate racism in any way, an intolerance toward being directed toward our people. So we were able to rally almost unanimous support from the legislature, and there was some substantial concern that we could not get strong support from the legislature. But as the legislature addressed the bill and addressed the reality of the circumstances and addressed the abuses that were taking place here in northern Idaho, that it became very apparent that we wanted to stop it right here. So it was passed with a large vote, as I said, and as a result of the passage, we've seen a substantial reduction in that harassment. Law enforcement officers from all over the state now use it as a tool and as a warning to groups or individuals that if you harass anybody as a result of racism or intolerance, that you're going to be subject to the law and the enforcement of that law.
Governor, one follow-up question, and that is, it's my understanding that after the passage of that legislation, what you're indicating, its enforcement across Idaho, and particularly North Idaho, the task force and its work, that as we see racial problems in other parts of the country, or racism, that we have been contacted as a model to look at of how you deal with that problem that arises. Is that correct?
Oh, that's very true. We're recognized as one of the more progressive states. Here we are, a little state in the Northwest with just 1 million people, a huge land area, independent-minded people. But we also recognize that we've got to support our neighbor in every way and not be tolerant in any way to any racial activity. And so other states now have recognized what we've done and are now looking to passing the same kind of legislation in their own states that we've been able to initiate here.
Thank you. Dr. Cargill.
Governor Evans, it has been suggested that by allowing racist groups, such as the Aryan nations, to exist in Idaho, we somehow are in support of their policies. I wonder if you'd care to comment on that.
Well, obviously, I don't think that anybody in Idaho really feels that way, but we've built a reputation around the country because it's been spotlighted here in northern Idaho and here in Kootenai County. When we think in terms of their rights as citizens, and they are citizens, they've located a compound here at Hayden Lake. They have the same rights of freedom of speech as we have, and even though we object to what they're saying and what they're doing and what they're preparing, as long as they're not violating the civil rights of any individual here in our state or here in the country, we have to tolerate their rights as we would object if they interfered with our rights of freedom of speech. So we don't agree with them in any way, but we also respect our democratic processes and democratic freedoms.
Janelle Berg.
Governor, you certainly have been active in traveling about the state and keeping in touch with the population of the state. What do you consider to be some of the problems of prejudice in Idaho? Not only just in the matter of racial prejudice, but in other areas of prejudice, and how do you think that the citizens can react to that?
We have a very special population within our state, and those are the criminals that are in our penal institutions that find themselves in very serious problems, suffering some prejudice as a result of getting jobs after they are released from prison. It's very difficult to convince employers that they have reformed, they're good citizens now, and it takes a lot of work, but we're working to overcome that particular problem. We are constantly having the problem of prejudice being directed against our American Indians throughout the state. We have several different tribes scattered throughout the state, and I think constantly the problems associated with the social environment on the Indian reservations, the competition between what we call the whites and the Indians are very heavy. So we see that prejudice taking place, and I keep emphasizing that in time and through education that we'll overcome all of those problems associated with our American Indians. We also have a very serious problem associated with those alcoholics that are facing the reality of finally getting off of the bottle, reforming themselves, and then convincing society that they can hold a job as well as anybody else, and they're discriminated against on a regular basis. And of course, we've got the Alcoholics Anonymous working very hard to find jobs, and I always like to compliment AA for the fine job they're doing for a very special segment of our society here in Idaho that finally have reformed and become good citizens.
If you were elected to national office, do you feel that the problems on the national level are somewhat different? And what kinds of areas would you concentrate on if you were to be elected to national office?
I think they're very much different. We're rather fortunate in Idaho because we are not intolerant in most cases, and we recognize the rights of individuals. We're always going to have those citizens who tend to be a little racist in the process, but we don't have a divided population in itself. Unfortunately, many states do have a divided population, and it's in many ways it's not very much different than what is happening in South Africa, except ours is not enforced. Ours is a social agreement among the races that you live over here and I'll live over here. But the problems on a national basis in every one of those states begins right there at home and right there in the educational process of those minority groups. They're not given the same opportunities as the others, as the white population. And I think on a national basis we must recognize that as being a national problem, and that we need to support in whenever we can with the resources we have available to make sure that we equalize those opportunities on a national basis, so that all of our citizens, regardless of race and color and creed, will have that opportunity to secure a very fine education and prepare themselves for the future in America.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you've joined our program in progress, our guest is the Honorable John Evans, who is the governor of the state of Idaho, and he's on campus as we're having our symposium on the issue of racism, prejudice, and progress, and we are continuing to discuss that with him. Governor, during this week's symposium, a number of the speakers, and during the question period, it has arisen in the discussions that across the United States, and certainly we're still saying this is a very small percentage, of course, of the population, but there has been a rise to some extent in the growth of the KKK and other white supremacist group in the last few years. Time was obviously there, and it declined, and it's been somewhat on the increase again, and that has been addressed by a number of speakers. Do you agree with this observation, and if so, why do you think that has happened in recent years?
I presume that it's happened in recent years, and I read the newspapers, and the statistics indicate there is some growth and upwelling of that kind of racist activity. And I presume because some of them are threatened. Some of them feel threatened by the competition of other groups. The blacks, you see the blacks in the southern states, southeastern United States, growing in numbers in relation to the white population, growing in political influence, and there's a striking back. They can't do it through the government area because we're enforcing our civil rights acts within the United States. And so they resort to whatever else they can do to try to protect their own holdings, their own, what they fear. Fear is a takeover of those states and those communities throughout the southern part of our country. So I think it's just a backlash against what we're trying to accomplish in America, that we will have freedom and opportunities and equality for all of our citizens, and we should strive toward that with all diligence.
Thank you. Dr. Cardle.
Governor Evans, to follow up on that just a bit, some social psychologists suggest that it is a natural inclination for individuals to break into groups, sometimes with clearly observable characteristics. If that's the case, how can we ever get away from a situation with people identifying with one racial group as being an in-group, and if it's a population majority, that being the majority, and other groups being the out-group?
Well, I don't think we should expect us to change those social trends that have occurred over the period of years. We'll always have those groups. We gather together ourselves and choose among ourselves within the neighborhood that we live in a social group, and every other ethnic, racial, or religious group does exactly the same thing. So we'd expect that to happen and continue to happen into the future. But what I emphasize is that we've got to then recognize the tolerance. Just because we have the number of different groups separating themselves as it's happened over the period of history, but we still have to recognize that we're going to have to be tolerant of the rights of those individuals so that we won't see them then drawing up size and fighting over those rights. We've got to respect the laws, and those laws will obviously have to be enforced throughout the country.
Janelle Burke.
Very important to our exercise of our citizenship is voting. Can you comment on the relationship of voting to prejudice, and particularly in some states we've heard a great deal about persons who couldn't register to vote and so forth. How do you feel about the Voting Rights Act, and would you like to see more enforcement of that act?
Well, I've always emphasized that we constantly limit the right of a person to vote in the United States for one reason or another. We always put little roadblocks in front of the people, and we do it here in Idaho. You know, the county clerks have the responsibility of choosing the registrars. They have the opportunity of having a roving registrar today to go in. That you don't have to go to the home; you can go to a shopping center. Well, that's a very progressive move, and you'd think that it'd be acceptable to every county clerk in the state of Idaho, but that's not true. Many of the county clerks resist that. They say, no, we've got the registrars here. If anybody wants to vote, they go find that registrar, find him at home, register to vote in the process. So that's a form of prejudice because the newcomer within our communities, and maybe they're of a minority group, it's very difficult for them to find those registrars. So we should eliminate those barriers whenever we can. I'd like to see, as much as anything else, move in the direction of what Art Murphy was a senator from Shoshone County for many, many years. He had the idea that we should move in the direction of postcard registration. So you'll sign your name, you'll send the postcard in to the registrar, and that should give you the opportunity in America to vote, in Idaho to vote, and that you shouldn't have to hunt up a registrar, go through all of the different hoops to become registered. I thought he was probably about 10 years ahead of his time, and I told him that. I said, in time, that will come to pass. That will come to pass, that a person's not going to have to search out, but they'll get a card in the mail from the registrar, and they'll sign it and send it in, and then they can vote in the election process itself. Over the period of time, we've recognized that minority groups within our state, particularly the Hispanics within the state, have not voted in the elections. We've made some massive efforts on a bipartisan basis to get them registered to vote, but there's been a reluctance because of problems associated with language, problems associated with education, not truly understanding, not really knowing the people involved in the process. And so even though we've made some massive efforts, we've not had that participation. In time through the educational process, I think all of that will come. And I keep emphasizing the importance of education in America because it's what's really going to make us more tolerant, more understanding, and build a better America for all of our people.
I would like to add to that. We've already indicated what the task force has been doing in our area. So model, and I think some of our viewers may not be aware that the same things happened in voting here. The late Carol Dietz, who was our clerk until her untimely death recently, was most supportive of that. In this county, we register people at the malls and on the college campus. In fact, the League of Women Voters is part of the registration system. So I can see what you're saying. And for example, last year, I believe the League of Women Voters registered between 2,000 and 3,000 people alone themselves by going out, and it really does work.
Yeah.
Something else that's come up during the week of the symposium, and that has to do with national legislation in the area of civil rights. And we've been talking a lot about the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965 and the significance they had not only in voting but in the use of facilities and accommodations and what it's done in the fields of education. I'm not asking you to indicate what you might do in the future, but if you were to be at the national level in the future in some capacity and you were viewing that legislation and how it's being administered, or what would be your reaction to that? Do we have sufficient legislation? Is there anything else that we need to do?
I've not reviewed that legislation of late, but I would suggest that it's being enforced rather well by the courts throughout the country. Obviously, some of us would like to see it move faster. We would think that we could integrate, for an example, our school system, or at least provide equal opportunities for all of the public school children within the state or within the nation. But that just takes time. And I keep emphasizing that if we move in the direction of improving the opportunities for education, teaching the children themselves that we will grow and mature as a result of those children growing and maturing and becoming more tolerant. You know, little children can't tell the difference in the color of skin or the slant of eyes or religious preferences. That comes in teaching at home. The intolerance starts right at home. And so if we become more tolerant at home, and then it'll carry over into the educational system, and it'll carry over into the future lives of our children and grandchildren, and that's what we must look to. But the Civil Rights Act generally, to me, has been handled very well. I'll just have to examine it a little more closely in light of what you're suggesting, because obviously we have some specialists that are looking at that law constantly and possibly would emphasize needs for change, which I would review.
Thank you. Dr. Cargill.
Governor Evans, Idaho Senator Steve Sims, one of the leading proponents of legislation to declare English the official language of the Republic, has been accused by some Hispanic groups of attempting to undermine their civil rights and promote prejudice against Hispanics by forcing this issue. I wonder if you'd care to comment on that.
You know, we have so many major issues facing this country today that I've been surprised that our junior senator from Idaho would pursue this with the diligence that he is pursuing it. I would a lot rather see him working on jobs for Idahoans and trying to create a better economic atmosphere for our state and our nation, rather than talking in terms of the English language being the official language through a constitutional amendment. It appears to me that what we have today is the English language truly is the language of America, but it does not prevent a family to continue to speak another language in the process, but to require, that the English language be the language, to me, is really not necessary, and that we should move in the direction of recognizing that we all need to recognize our roots. Those who are recent immigrants to the United States, and a good share of our Hispanic population have only been here a generation or two, where some of our families have been here for 6 or 8 generations here in the United States. So we need to recognize that those languages will prevail for a period of time. I always think in terms of my own roots and my own background. My forefathers came from Wales. When they first came from Wales, it was the desire of that family to immediately start speaking the English language and move away from the Welsh language. But the Welsh language was very prominent for a period of years, and it finally disappeared in the process. I feel sorry that it did disappear. I often think in terms, and I asked my mother one time.
I'm sorry to have to interrupt. We're out of time, and we'd love to have more time with you. Thank you so much, Governor. It's been outstanding having you with us. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Governor John Evans, speaking on our subject in this series on racism, prejudice, and progress. Be with us next week for the final program. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at this same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by a North Idaho College student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.